Ralph Hsu was a really brilliant research chemist, and he managed huge research budgets in the sciences. And he always had a hobby throughout his adult life of trying to integrate Eastern thought and Western thought and try to bring together the best of both. So a fascinating figure, grew up in extreme poverty in Hawaii, where his parents had been imported from China to work as laborers in the cane fields of Hawaii. So he had made quite a transition, and my association with him started informally. We were both serving on a nonprofit board together, and I gradually realized as we started to meet for lunch together that he was becoming a teacher of mine, and that just largely by the questions he asked me, he got me to widen the lens I was looking at the world through, and to see my analytic work as a lawyer in a much larger context, in a much larger framework, to see the full range of human possibility in the world. And that breadth of vision was something which was, as I started to pick it up from him, it was extremely important to me. This is where I first got the idea of wisdom, that the practice of wisdom might give us a larger sense of things, which would make us not only happier and fuller people, but would make us more effective in the world.
Could that be described as seeing the big picture to some extent?
That's a big piece of it. And also, so for example, in seeing the big picture, you could be less impatient with things. You might see a situation of injustice at the present time, but you know, maybe this is an injustice which will resolve itself on its own in a few years, and you don't have to turn it into a contentious subject right now by pushing for an immediate shift in practices. So that was what you might call seeing the big picture. Another element of seeing the big picture was to understand the impermanence of everything. That if you won a victory today, that may be a very significant achievement, but it may not last more than 5 years or 10 years.
And in the long run, we're all dead.
Well, and now in this century, in the 21st century, we're confronted with all kinds of problems like global climate disruption, where we're not going to see outcomes for tens of years, 10 or hundreds of years. And we all have to work for environmentally protective outcomes which our children and grandchildren will have to assess. So that's the big picture that you speak of. Now he also used the term Chinese baseball, and that was important for me. He asked me one day over lunch whether I knew what Chinese baseball was. I said no, I'd never heard the term. And he said, well, Chinese baseball is exactly the same as American baseball, but with one difference. Whenever the ball is in the air, any player on the field can move any base. So, so you know, in a way that's like describing chaos.
Yeah. You can't get to first.
He said that you don't know where first base is going to be by the time you've run down the.
Yeah.
So he suggested this not just as a kind of a whimsical idea, but also as a way of thinking about the world. This was a kind of metaphor, and he said that many of the things many of our most important and interesting challenges can be conceived of as a kind of Chinese baseball, and that I should be prepared for things to change rapidly and radically, and that I shouldn't be so fixated on particular outcomes, thinking that there's some kind of linear connection between my effort here and a certain outcome there. Yeah. I could make the best effort I could, and because it is Chinese baseball, not American baseball, you know, I don't know whether the outcome would be what I would hope for. It might be something quite different.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.